Hi, this is Kathleen with KwiltArt. Welcome to part 8, sewing all the pieces together for the KwiltArt's video series for making the convex illusions and poppin' and quilt patterns. Now we're going to sew all of the triangles onto the center. We're going to start with the shaded triangles, and we're going to be doing the dark triangles from square one first. We're going to sew those onto all four sides. The edge of the triangle is not long enough for the edge of the center. Don't stretch to fit. We have an area of forgiveness here where we can just cut off part of the tip off the center. That way we have a little bit of leeway for inconsistencies in quarter and seam allowances. So once we get the dark triangles sewn on, we're going to sew on the lighter triangles and just be lining up the center and make sure your ends are coming out at the same point on each end there, and go ahead and sew those on. For the pressing, for all of these seams, you're going to press towards the center. It's counterintuitive, but it's going to be important when we get out to these areas. So for all of the triangles, as we're sewing them on, we're going to be pressing the seam allowances towards the center. So now that we have all of the shaded triangles sewn to the center, we're going to be doing the outer corners. So we're initially going to be putting the outer corner on top of the center, like this. And you're going to have your triangle sticking out here. Eventually that will be appliqued to the background. We're not going to be pinning on this side. It's intuitive to pin on this side, but we're actually going to turn this over so that we can see the seam allowances. We need to sew right up to one seam allowance and then start sewing again after a seam allowance. So what we have here is we're going to be sewing. We're going to start out here. We're going to sew right up to the seam allowance. This seam allowance that's right here. We're going to sew right up to that seam allowance, just a thread before it, and then maybe do a little bit of a back tack. Stop sewing, cut your thread, and then come over to this side. And now we're going to start sewing over here, just a thread on the other side of this seam allowance right here. So we'll start sewing up here, just over here, do a little back tack, and sew all the way out to the edge. And when that is sewn on, we are going to press the seam allowance towards the center, and it will end up looking like this. And then we're going to just take that triangle and we're going to pull it out and we're going to pop it right on top of the background. Now I have already turned under the edge here 1/4 of an inch and I've pressed it. This is a great area where you could use the double-sided tape. Just put the tape right along the edge and then mark your 1/4 inch seam allowance and then just fold it over, give it a little finger press, and then lay it on your background. You'll still have a little bit of exposed tape, and then lay that down, hit it with an iron, and I would also put in a couple of pins. And then you are ready to either machine or hand applique along this edge here. If you're going to do by machine, I would just come inside the edge maybe about 1/8 of an inch. And by hand, just use a thread that will match the top here. And then once you get that sewn down on the back, you've got excess background fabric here. You can cut that away, just leaving about 1/4 of an inch inside the sewing line for a seam allowance. Thank you for viewing part 8. Part 9 will be quilting.